Clint Eastwood is no stranger to the spotlight. For decades, he's been a Hollywood legend, known for his tough, no-nonsense attitude both on and off the screen. But one recent encounter in a busy public setting proved that, even at his age, Eastwood still knows how to command a room without ever raising his voice. It all started when a well-known liberal journalist, eager to make a statement, decided to confront him in front of a crowd. People were going about their day, sipping coffee, chatting with friends, and minding their own business when the journalist spotted Eastwood sitting quietly at a table. Seeing an opportunity, he approached with a smug expression, his voice loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. With cameras rolling and an audience forming, he wasted no time taking a jab at Eastwood's political views, mocking his past statements and labeling him as outdated in today's world. At first, the room was filled with murmurs and a few chuckles from those who agreed with the journalist. Some pulled out their phones, ready to capture what they assumed would be another viral moment of someone putting a celebrity in their place. But what happened next was something no one expected. Instead of firing back with anger or getting defensive, Eastwood remained calm. He didn't flinch. He didn't interrupt. He simply let the journalist say his piece. And then, with the kind of quiet confidence that has made him a legend, he responded in a way that left the entire room in stunned silence. There was no yelling, no insults, no dramatic outburst. Just a few carefully chosen words that completely shifted the energy in the room. The journalist, who moments ago had been riding high on his confidence, suddenly found himself struggling for a response. The crowd, once buzzing with anticipation, was now hanging on to Eastwood's every word. What did he say? How did he turn the situation around with nothing but his presence and wisdom? Well, that's where things get interesting. For a moment, the entire cafe seemed frozen in time. The journalist, who had walked in with such confidence, suddenly looked less sure of himself. His smirk faded just slightly as he realized that Clint Eastwood wasn't going to react the way he had expected. No anger, no frustration, just calm, steady eyes that had seen a lifetime of moments like this. The people around them leaned in, their curiosity growing. Some had started filming, thinking they were about to witness a heated argument. But Eastwood wasn't giving them what they wanted. Instead, he sat back, studying the man in front of him with an almost amused expression. "You done?" Eastwood finally asked, his voice low but steady. It wasn't a challenge, just a question. But somehow, it carried more weight than the journalist's entire speech. The journalist hesitated, clearly not expecting that reaction. He had come prepared for a fight, armed with arguments and sharp words, but he hadn't prepared for silence. A few people chuckled, sensing the shift in power. The journalist cleared his throat, trying to regain control. "I just think," he began, his voice louder now, "that people like you, these old-school, outdated figures, don't really have a place in the conversation anymore." Eastwood tilted his head slightly, as if considering the words. Then he leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. "You know," he said, his voice still calm, "I've seen this before. A lot of times, actually. Someone walks in, thinking they have everything figured out, thinking they can talk louder, talk faster, and somehow that makes them right." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But what you don't realize is, the world doesn't change just because you demand it to. It changes when people actually listen." The journalist opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. The crowd had shifted now. Before, they had been waiting for a spectacle, but now they were captivated by something else. The weight of experience. The quiet authority of a man who had spent decades proving that actions always spoke louder than words. One woman in the crowd whispered, "Wow," under her breath. A few others nodded, watching closely. The journalist, realizing the audience was no longer fully on his side, tried again. "I'm just saying," he muttered, "times are different now. People don't care about what some old actor thinks anymore." Eastwood didn't move. He just looked at him, waiting. The silence stretched, and for the first time, the journalist seemed uncomfortable. And then, just when it seemed like the moment couldn't get any tenser, the journalist shifted uncomfortably, his confidence fading with each passing second. The weight of the silence was pressing down on him, and he knew he had to regain control of the conversation. He straightened his posture, forcing a chuckle. "All right, so you've got away with words," he admitted, trying to sound unaffected. "But let's be real, Clint, what do you actually have to say that matters today? The world has changed. People don't look to old Hollywood actors for wisdom anymore." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people exchanged glances, curious to see how Eastwood would respond. Others folded their arms, waiting for a real confrontation. They wanted drama. They wanted sparks to fly. But Eastwood remained still, his sharp eyes locked onto the journalist. "That's the problem, isn't it?" Eastwood finally said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried through the room with ease. "People don't listen unless there's a show. They want arguments, not conversations. They want someone to be right and someone to be wrong." He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the words settle in before continuing. "But the truth is, the world hasn't changed as much as you think. People still crave leadership, wisdom, and experience. They just don't know where to look for it anymore." The journalist scoffed. "So you think you're some kind of role model," he challenged. "A symbol of the good old days." Eastwood didn't take the bait. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, a hint of a smirk playing on his lips. "I don't think about myself that much," he said simply. "But I do think about people like you, so sure of everything, so ready to tear someone down just to prove a point. You didn't come over here to have a real conversation. You came to make a scene." The journalist's face darkened. He glanced around, realizing that the crowd was no longer on his side. The excitement had faded, replaced with something else: respect. Not just for Eastwood, but for the way he handled himself. A young man in the crowd, who had been quietly observing, suddenly spoke up. "Maybe that's the real issue," he said, looking at the journalist. "You're trying to win a fight that doesn't need to happen." For the first time, the journalist looked unsure. He had walked in expecting an easy victory, a viral moment where he got to expose an old legend as outdated and irrelevant. But instead, he was the one struggling to keep up. And Eastwood, he wasn't even trying. He was just being himself. And then, just as the tension reached its peak, the journalist's fingers tightened around his phone, the glow of the screen reflecting off his face. He had come in ready to dominate this conversation, ready to control the narrative. But somehow, without even raising his voice, Clint Eastwood had turned the moment into something entirely different. The air in the cafe felt heavier now. The quiet murmur of conversations had faded completely, replaced by an unspoken question lingering between everyone in the room. What was going to happen next? The journalist could feel it. He wasn't just losing control of the conversation, he was losing the room. He forced a laugh, shaking his head. "So what? You're saying that people like me don't matter. That asking tough questions makes me the bad guy." His voice was sharper now, a hint of frustration creeping in. Eastwood took his time before responding. He studied the journalist for a moment, then let out a slow breath. "No," he said, his voice calm. "I'm saying that people like you matter a lot, but what you do with that matters even more." The words cut through the air like a blade. The journalist opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Somewhere in the back, a chair creaked as someone leaned forward, waiting for more. The tension was thick now, stretching between them like an invisible rope. The journalist knew he had one last chance to turn things around, to regain the upper hand. If he could just say the right thing, land the right punchline, he could still walk away looking like the winner. He straightened up, forcing another smirk. "All right," he said, "let's test this theory of yours. If the world still values wisdom so much, let's see how they react when I ask you this." He paused for effect, scanning the room. "What's your biggest regret?" The crowd reacted immediately. A few gasps, a few murmurs. Even those who had been only half paying attention were fully invested now. It was a bold move, a personal question meant to shake Eastwood, to put him on the defensive. But Eastwood didn't flinch. He didn't shift uncomfortably or look away. Instead, he let the question hang in the air, as if considering it deeply. The room felt even smaller now, as if every single person inside was holding their breath, waiting for his answer. And just as the silence became unbearable, just as the journalist thought he had finally cracked him, Eastwood leaned forward, his voice lower than before. "You really want to know?" he asked. The journalist nodded. The crowd was still. And then, in the space of a heartbeat, Eastwood said something that changed everything. The cafe was dead silent. Every single person in the room was leaning in, waiting for Clint Eastwood's answer. The journalist sat there, his smirk replaced by something else, anticipation, maybe even a flicker of doubt. He had asked the question expecting to put Eastwood on the spot, to finally knock him off balance. But something about the way Eastwood looked at him made it clear this wasn't going to go the way he thought. Eastwood exhaled slowly, then finally spoke. "My biggest regret," he repeated, as if turning the words over in his mind. Then he shook his head. "Nah, I don't think you're ready for that." A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Some exchanged glances, others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The journalist blinked, caught off guard. He had expected a cliché answer, maybe something about Hollywood or a past decision. But Eastwood's response wasn't just unexpected. It was deliberate. It put the journalist right back on the defensive. The journalist let out a nervous chuckle, but his voice was thinner now. "Come on, Clint. You're the one talking about wisdom, about people needing to listen. And now you don't want to answer." Eastwood tilted his head slightly, the hint of a smile on his lips. "It's not that I don't want to answer," he said. "It's that you're asking the wrong question." More murmurs from the crowd. The journalist's fingers tapped against the table. He was losing control again, and he knew it. He needed to regain his footing, to shift the power back in his favor. "All right then," he said, leaning forward. "What's the right question?" Eastwood studied him for a long moment. And then, just when the journalist thought he wouldn't answer, he finally spoke. "The real question," Eastwood said, "is what your biggest regret is." The journalist's mouth opened slightly, as if to reply, but no words came out. The energy in the room shifted. People weren't just watching Eastwood anymore. Now they were looking at the journalist. His jaw tightened. He hadn't expected this. He had come here to put Eastwood in the hot seat, to expose him, to make him stumble. But now the spotlight was on him. And suddenly he wasn't sure he wanted it. For the first time, he looked unsure. Maybe even vulnerable. He glanced around, realizing that the moment had flipped on him entirely. And then, before he could say anything, someone else spoke. A voice from the back of the cafe. A voice that no one had noticed before. And what they said next changed everything. A deep voice from the back of the cafe cut through the thick silence. "I can tell you what his biggest regret is." Every head in the room turned. A man, older but strong in presence, stepped forward from the shadows. His weathered face held a quiet authority, the kind that demanded attention without saying much at all. The journalist's face paled slightly. He clearly recognized him. The man took a slow step closer, his eyes locked onto the journalist. "I remember you," he said. "A few years back, you wrote an article about me, twisted my words, made me out to be something I wasn't." He let out a humorless chuckle. "Cost me my job. My reputation." A wave of whispers rushed through the cafe. The journalist's shoulders stiffened. He opened his mouth, but the man wasn't done. "You never cared about the truth," he said. "You just wanted a headline." His gaze darkened. "And I bet that's your biggest regret." The journalist swallowed hard. His confidence, his charm, both were gone. He looked around, but no one was on his side anymore. They weren't laughing. They weren't waiting for him to come up with another witty remark. They were waiting for the truth. Clint Eastwood, still calm, still unreadable, took one final sip of his coffee. Then, as if he had been expecting this moment all along, he leaned back in his chair and spoke. "You came here today thinking you were the one asking the questions," he said, his voice steady. "But the real question is, when do you start answering them?" The journalist's hands clenched into fists, his mind racing for a way out, a way to spin this. But there was none. The weight of everything he had done, every moment he had tried to manipulate, now sat on his shoulders for everyone to see. The cafe remained silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The journalist stood there, stripped of the confidence he had walked in with. And for the first time in his career, he had no words. Eastwood stood up, pushing his chair back slowly. He looked at the journalist one last time, then gave him a slight nod. Not of pity, not of mockery, just understanding. Then, without another word, he walked toward the door. The journalist stayed frozen, his mind replaying everything that had just happened. And as Eastwood stepped out into the daylight, the last thing the journalist heard was the quiet murmur of the crowd, whispering, watching, and realizing that maybe, just maybe, they had just witnessed something bigger than a debate. Something real. The journalist remained frozen in place long after Clint Eastwood had walked out the door. The cafe was still buzzing, but now with quiet conversations, people exchanging glances, processing what they had just witnessed. He could feel their eyes on him, not with admiration, not with curiosity, but with something else, expectation. He had spent years controlling narratives, shaping stories, making sure he always had the last word. But now for the first time, he realized he wasn't the one telling this story. He was the story, and not in the way he had planned. Slowly, he sank back into his chair, his mind replaying every decision, every moment that had led him here. He had wanted to expose Eastwood, to make a statement. Instead, he had been the one exposed. Across the room, the older man who had spoken earlier gave him one last look before turning away. No gloating, no satisfaction, just the quiet weight of truth. Outside, Clint Eastwood disappeared into the crowd, his job here done without ever raising his voice. And as the journalist sat there, staring at the empty chair across from him, he finally understood. Some lessons don't need to be shouted. Some are felt in the silence,